The rain pelted against the windows as Jeremy sat alone in his new house, the soft glow of the television flickering in the dimly lit living room. He had moved in a few weeks ago, trying to settle into a quieter life after his job had transferred him to this small town in the middle of nowhere. It was peaceful here, maybe too peaceful. Jeremy was used to the noise and commotion of city life, but the isolation of this place was unsettling. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, and his house was surrounded by thick, looming trees that seemed to close in around him at night. As he lounged on the couch, he heard a faint knock at the door. It was strange. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. His phone had no service in this remote area, and he hadn't given his address to anyone yet. The knock came again, louder this time. Jeremy stood and approached the front door, his stomach tight with unease. He hesitated, glancing out the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. "Hello?" he called out through the door. Silence. Another knock, more insistent now. Jeremy's heart began to race as he gripped the doorknob. Something didn't feel right. He felt a chill in the air, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep through the wood of the door. He tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a traveler caught in the storm seeking shelter. But when he opened the door, no one was there. Only the rain-soaked porch and the forest beyond it greeted him. Confused, Jeremy stepped outside, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The rain drenched him almost instantly, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. He shut the door behind him, wiping the water from his face. Suddenly, a soft voice whispered from behind him. "Let me in." Jeremy froze. He hadn't left the television on, but the flickering lights from the living room now cast long shadows against the walls. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly, he turned around. There, standing in the center of his living room, was a woman. Her clothes were soaked, her hair dripping wet. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared at him without blinking. I didn't hear you come in," Jeremy stammered, his throat tightening. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You left the door open for me." Jeremy took a step back. "Who are you?" She didn't answer, only tilting her head slightly, watching him. Her smile grew wider, unnatural, stretching too far across her pale face. Then, without moving her lips, he heard her voice in his mind again. "Let me in." A sharp pain shot through Jeremy's head, and he clutched his temples. His vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt around him. The woman was closer now, though she hadn't moved an inch. Her presence felt suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jeremy stumbled backward, crashing into the kitchen counter. His hands groped for something, anything he could use to defend himself. His fingers closed around a kitchen knife, and he raised it shakily in front of him. "Stay back!" he shouted, but the words felt weak, hollow. The woman's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then she began to move, slowly at first, her feet barely touching the ground as she glided toward him. Jeremy felt a surge of adrenaline. He lunged forward with the knife, but his hand passed right through her as if she were made of smoke. He gasped and stumbled again, crashing into the table. The knife clattered to the floor. The woman hovered above him now, her face inches from his. "Let me in," she whispered again, her breath cold against his skin. And then, without warning, she disappeared. Jeremy scrambled to his feet, panting heavily. The house was silent again, save for the sound of the rain outside. He stood there for what felt like hours, clutching the counter, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. He cautiously walked back to the living room. The television was off. Everything seemed normal, but Jeremy knew better. Something had been here. Something had entered his home. And it wasn't gone. In the following days, Jeremy tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and stress. But every night, just after midnight, the knocking would return, 3 sharp raps on the door, always at the same time. And always the same voice, whispering from somewhere deep inside the house. "Let me in." Jeremy stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. His days became a blur of paranoia and fear as the knocking grew louder, more persistent. He moved through the house in a haze, his thoughts consumed by the visitor who would not leave him alone. One night, after hours of pacing, Jeremy decided he couldn't take it anymore. He would open the door. He would confront whatever was out there and end this nightmare once and for all. He stood in front of the door, trembling. The knock came, louder than ever. His hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking unconned.